That's an interesting question because the links are very indirect in a way. There are many aspects which are about, how, say, data is more and more common and more kind of around us. And in some way, everybody he has a relationship with data in some way or another. And fair enough, everybody has a relationship with learning as well. So the straightforward story is that more and more data is being used to understand every aspect of our life. And learning is a very important aspect of our life. And therefore, taking this data view of the way we learn is becoming something more and more important, and especially because it's a bit less like physical exercise where you have a lot of self-tracking and monitoring devices. Monitoring learning is much more fuzzy, much more complicated. It's more of a notion which is harder to grasp and concretely understand and measure. And it's why it makes such an interesting research aspect of the project, which is what we are trying to do is get data to be able to measure and get people to understand the way they learn in a way which is directly visible and that can be manipulated. Now, what is even more interesting is that somehow a lot of that has been done before. In a sense, there is this field called learning analytics, which really starting emerging maybe 5-10 years ago on exactly this aspect of trying to measure and monitor learning in order to try to make it more efficient and more effective. But at the same time, as data is exploding and we get more and more of this technology, learning is entirely changing. There are more and more platforms for online learning. There is more and more informal learning happening. There is the emergence of MOOCs, and generally a switch from the idea that learning happens in a classroom with a teacher to learning happens everywhere, including in a classroom and in a teacher, but it also happens while you watch a YouTube video or while you are interacting with your friends on Facebook. So the core of the project is really that. If we have to use data to understand learning, we have to use data from everywhere to understand learning everywhere. And that means that we both have to figure out the challenge on how to manage, organize, analyze all this, what becomes truly big data, because it's very varied, it's very large, and it's very complex in nature. And on how to extract and distill from this data what is fundamentally learning, how it is represented, how it is captured in everyday activities, so that we can help learners in understanding how they can make their learning behavior more efficient and how to kind of self-reflect on what it is that they are learning, even if it is not in a typical learning situation. So it's for me, this is where it goes, is the intersection of a very important part of our life, learning, with the challenges that are brought by the technology from the kind of our greater ability to access resources and to use things online, and our greater ability to collect data about it. And this kind of push towards self-monitoring and self-understanding on the aspects of learning. It's an interesting thing because the changes are enormous, and I think this is really what is core in AFEL, is that it is really kind of trying to put together two areas that are changing very rapidly. So what is clearly changing in learning is this kind of this switch I was talking about between learning being an activity for which has clear boundaries, which happen in systems which are closed systems and which are really dedicated to learning happening in kind of almost any situation, and even if it's using resources which are actually designed for learning, it might be using them in an informal situation in different locations, different areas, in different places. And this is where the future of learning is. In a way, universities, for example, are switching more and more from being, say, the learning delivery mechanism, a place where you go to learn, from being mostly the generator of content and the kind of the connector, the hub, for people who are learning all along and using different things to connect and kind of validate and qualify that in something which is recognized as having acquired a certain knowledge and skill. So, and I think this is exactly the future of learning. The future of learning is one in which we learn every day and everywhere, and that is actually recognized and understood as learning, compared to, well, we always have been learning every day and everywhere, but the only learning that was captured and recognized was the one which was happening in formal areas. So, and I say, there's clear evidence of this happening. More and more universities use MOOCs or encourage their students to go to external MOOCs, to go to YouTube videos and use open resources as part of their curriculum, because there is no reason for them to restrict students to their own learning material and their own learning systems. And that, I say, there is no doubt that this is going to increase. And what's interesting with AFEL is that what we are trying to do is kind of anticipate on that and capture it and make it, something that we can already recognize. Because if we don't recognize it now, in the future, we will kind of our ability to understand and value and promote learning is going to be dramatically reduced compared to what could be done and what the technology afford. So the other part really is on this idea of self-monitoring and self-tracking. This is clearly again a trend which is more and more visible, and therefore it is clear that in the future a learner, an everyday learner, will be somebody who will be using everything that the web has to offer, every possible platform, whether they are dedicated to learning or not, as well as the ability to understand and to reflect on how they are using this for learning, how to formulate what they are doing, and that seems to be completely diverse activities, into a set of learning goals and a set of learning trajectories, and to understand how they are progressing and how they are acquiring knowledge by, the efficient use of all these different resources. So it's really, the summary is a future learner is a learner that uses AFEL tools, because this is exactly what we are trying to do. We are trying to make people better able to monitor and be aware of how they use online resources wherever they are in order to learn and develop themselves. That's an interesting question, because, well, they necessarily get smarter out of using the resources they use already. What we are trying to do is to provide them with a tool to get smarter in their learning. So basically, a lot of learning is self-reflection. It's a very naive idea to think that, you read a book, what you have learned is the content of the book. Somehow there is a process and a behavior when you learn that necessarily has to include self-reflection and has to include an understanding on how you're acquiring the knowledge, what is the right way of doing it, or say, more than the right way, because there might be many different right ways of doing it. What is the ways that it will work for you and how you are developing through your learning. And therefore, this is how people will get smarter through having access to this sort of technologies, is because then they will have the tool to really interpret and understand and reflect on their own behavior, which they would do anyway in kind of typical situation of learning. But one of the challenges is that because learning is becoming so diverse, and therefore is generating so much more data, the interpretation of this behavior and this use of resources become more complex. So it's really a kind of a medium. This tool will be a medium for learners to self-reflect based on the enormous amount of data they might generate just out of going online and trying to learn something out of it. One which I'm more kind of directly, my background is more related to, is a technical one, is the contribution will be the technologies that will make this self-monitoring and self-reflection possible, and the analysis of the data. So that creating the tool that makes it. The other one, which possibly is immensely more important, is in building this tool and in making this, we will have to gain a better understanding, a better theoretical understanding of what it means to learn. Because in usual and typical situation, we didn't have to. I mean, if somebody goes to university and has an activity in a classroom and has an exam, you don't need to know exactly what it means to learn to recognize that this is a learning activity. A lot of what we are doing in the project is going back to the theoretical notion, especially in the work with a psychologist in the project, is understanding fundamentally when is learning happening, how is learning happening, and what makes learning efficient or not efficient, what is making learning more effective. And this theoretical work, this understanding of learning that we need to build in order to build the technology, that's going to be a really key contribution.